Ah, certainly has been a long wait, hasn't it? In a lot of ways. It's been since August since my last review. It's been since September 2016 since the last Gunvolt game, which actually served as the pilot episode for shooting Stardust for all you people that needed to see my face as much as humanly possible. And I've been waiting for this specific game since it launched on September 26th. It arrived January 9th. Thanks so much for that limited run.
But yeah, it's been a damn long time since the last major Gunvolt release, hasn't it? With barely a word on the possibility of what I presume to be the inevitable Gunvolt 3, the last several years have been filled with only minor releases like the Striker Pack for 3DS and Switch, the less said from me on the topic of Mighty Gunvolt Burst the better, and an OVA I still haven't seen because it's only released outside Japan was on the 3DS, which is possibly the worst way to buy an OVA I can think of. That is, until the announcement of a spin-off game, Gunvolt Chronicles, starring Copen instead of Gunvolt, to be released for the Switch. Initially, when Travis Strikes Again moved in a direction I wasn't happy with, Gunvolt Chronicles was the biggest reason I had to buy a Switch. Well, luckily for my funds, after a year of silence, versions for PC and PS4 were announced for same-day release, and even a port for the Xbox One came later. And now I'm finally joining in on the party. Still without a Switch. Before we get started on Gunvolt Chronicles and its nonsensical subtitle, let's go back for a second to Gunvolt 2 since it was the one that introduced Copen as a playable character. As opposed to Gunvolt, who worked best by staying back and tagging enemies to drain their health with electricity, Copen was all about dashing in and away and peppering enemies with bullets, and using boss weapons, almost like this is a Mega Man game. While a defined conclusion on which character was more fun to play is up to personal opinion, having a second option with varied gameplay was unquestionably a great inclusion, and gave Copen a life of his own to explore in future games. As Gunvolt Chronicles begins after a quick reintroduction to the threatened existence of ordinary humans, or Minos as they're called, we join with Copen and Lola searching for something called the Butterfly Effect, which leads them into battle with a lightning adept named Blade. Tell me if you believe Copen and Lola for a second that Blade is male.
我が名はブレイド。大いなるスメラギの意志に基づき、いくつ
Just as the fight is starting to turn sour, Copen is rescued by a few human kids, and something in him decides to stay. From here, it's a battle against Sumeragi's elite falcons in his search for the butterfly effect, and to protect these kids the Luminous Avenger just met. To go any further into details would be going into spoilers, so I'll stop here. While I'm not expecting anything spectacular, the Gunvolt games do have stories with a lot of character, both in terms of humor and emotional connections. For the most part, each character had a core group of characters with defined relationships that gave them a believable reason to fight. It was the strongest aspect of those stories, so it's kinda sad that it doesn't really carry over to this one. I understand why the humans latch on to Copen, a human himself strong enough to fight the oppressive Sumeragi, but Copen just accepts living with them without argument, without even considering the fact that his presence could put them in danger. I'm not saying it's unbelievable that a colder guy like Copen would stick his neck out for them. You can come up with a plausible reason if you read between the lines, but any in-game explanation is sorely lacking. And that's a common thread across a lot of story beats in this game, a lack of due build-up and explanation. Did you know that this game takes place in an alternate timeline following the bad ending of the first Gunvolt? I didn't until I was doing research after finishing the game, because the in-game reveal doesn't give enough details, at least I didn't get the hint. A minor bit of information about the setting is only revealed so late into the game it might as well be a big twist. There are moments that should have profound emotional impact, they're presented as such, but there's no proper hints to lead into it, it just shows up and is done in the span of one boss fight. And if you didn't play Gunvolt 2, which is non-canon in this timeline, you would be totally lost. And if you did play it, you'd be wondering how events that played out in that game are still backstory here. It also doesn't particularly help that, frankly, a lot of the characters just aren't interesting. Aside from maybe Kohaku, the humans are all one-note and forgettable when they should be an emotional core. Blade could be interesting, but their backstory is woefully unexplored. The villain, what should be the driving force of the journey, doesn't exist until the primary bosses are beaten and doesn't get anything other than a name and position until 1 minute before the final fight. The bosses in previous games were usually somewhat quirky, but most of the quirks here come down to speech patterns this time. Just saying, as much as it runs counter to practically everyone else who's played these games, I think the best writing in the series came from the first incomplete translation of the first game, and that soul is sadly absent here. The other factor affecting the complexity of the story and its presentation is the lack of mid-stage conversations with Copen, Lola, and the boss this time around. Now, these conversations were always a bit of a sore point with the older games because their method of subtitling took up a drastic part of the screen. I didn't completely miss them in the original translation of the first game. But now that they have a lot of extra resolution to work with a slick UI that keeps Lola's comments relegated to an out-of-the-way corner, mid-stage dialogue didn't have to be intrusive this time, but it's just gone entirely. That's not the only area where Intercreate's neglected to take full advantage of full HD resolutions either. The quality of their sprite work is great as always, but they're taking up too much of the screen. Like, this is secretly still a handheld game just upscaled on a TV screen. Which I suppose I should get used to really soon. The artwork gets a big benefit being in HD, but it doesn't do much for the lack of character portraits. Copen, the main character, has 2. Really, the most exciting part of the visuals are the stages that look like remakes of the Mega Man Zero games. This stage in particular is also much better than its Mega Man Zero counterpart because the stages in this game are all good. I admittedly missed the gimmicks that made them stand out for reasons beyond design and setting, but so long as it doesn't result in another water stage from the original Gunvolt, I won't lose sleep over it. Because high-level Copen gameplay is so built on dashing from target to target without landing, there is a certain flow to the levels if you know exactly what you're doing. I'm nowhere near good enough to make it look smooth, but I do tend to get combos over 1000 kudos more frequently than I did in Gunvolt 2 to hear that sweet, sweet J-pop. And awaiting at the end of every stage is a boss. The Gunvolt games always have aggressive bosses where pattern recognition is key to surviving. You know, unless you were playing as Copen, whose Pervasion dodge was so overpowered that it was a badge of honor for a boss to be able to damage you. Well, I'm happy to report the Pervasion has been nerfed, so you once again have to try, and you will have to, because some of these guys are damn hostile. They're fast, they're strong, and they cover a lot of ground with some attacks. Actually, I think the precision needed goes a bit overboard. And that's not even talking about their desperation attacks, which turn everything up to 11 and tend to last too long. That's not to say Copen doesn't have his means to turn the tables, because boss weapons are just that magic ticket. Back in Gunvolt 2, I rarely used the extra weapons aside from the drills because I didn't need to, but here, a lot of them have serious use. Anchor Nexus is great for chaining regular enemies with its homing attack. Photon Detonator is just a bunch of bombs that pack a punch, and Hot Damn Orbital Edge is just for people who like Wheels of Death. Even against bosses who aren't specifically weak to them, they sometimes end up being the better option. And the energy recharge is just fast enough to keep them from being endlessly spammed, but they're still viable. And if that's just not enough firepower, the weapons can all be powered up through the use of Darkness Trigger. This grants infinite energy and auto-fires whatever weapon is equipped when close to an enemy, at the cost of constantly draining health. Don't worry, it can't kill you, but if you're not used to playing perfectly for that high score, it leaves you in a very fragile state. Because of that, and because I don't like having firing control taken away from me, I could go the entire game without using it. In my eyes, the only thing it provides is Lola's new design when she goes berserk, which finally provides official proof of what fan art has claimed for years. That little pod got a nice butt. If you're still outgunned after all that, Copen and Lola can team up for a super attack, the Twin Shredder, a screen nuke that deals moderate damage to bosses. And that's the only choice, compared to the multiple special attack choices Gunvolt enjoys. Trust me, as expensive as it is, save your money for the upgrade that gives Twin Shredder a full health restore, because it's the only option you're going to get for a quick boost, and frankly, it's kind of the only thing in the store I think is worthwhile. Lola's anthem almost never triggers if you don't grind talking, so don't count on it kicking in when you really need it. Just keep breaking your combos to drop to the ground and pick up the coins enemies drop. Really wish they'd just magnetized, Copen. Maybe you don't need the help if you're planning to go in hardcore. It'll take some practice and patience, but you've got infinite lives and it won't take much time. On my first playthrough, when I had plenty of trouble, my final time was still under 2.5 hours. The second time, this recording was under 2. And there's not much else to do after the credits for those that just aren't interested in perfection. You could find all 4 bonus emblems in each stage, but it's just for points. Get a rank higher than the consistent B I always seem to get. 6 bonus missions open up in post-game, but they're just truncated, harder versions of the regular stages, and as far as I'm aware, there's no reward for clearing all 6. Hey, at least they don't pad this game out by making you beat the final stage twice to get a true ending. Whether you get your money's worth out of Gunvolt Chronicles is entirely dependent on how much you enjoy the game as it is. If you're into the speedrunner or score attack mentality, getting those perfect runs is going to take work and precision. If you're just a casual player who just likes Gunvolt like me, it's a well-designed Mega Man-esque game that'll be fun to play several times in the future, but it's pretty light on content. If I wasn't such a big fan of physical discs, I'd really be regretting spending all that extra time and money on the physical copy.
Hell, I do still kind of regret it a bit. I waited 3 months for this.
The gameplay here is polished and satisfying, more so than either previous entry, but because it had a much better story and 2 characters, Azure Striker Gunvolt 2 still beats it out as the best game in the Gunvolt series. Thankfully, Intercreates is in an easy place to improve with this formula, and because they've been so adamant about christening Azure Striker Gunvolt and Gunvolt Chronicles as separate series, I'm sure a sequel will come. If I may suggest, perhaps Blade can be added as a second playable character? I know you guys are damn good at sword action. Gunvolt had already long been called the spiritual successor to Mega Man Zero. Just fill the gap all the way if you aren't going to make ZX3. But please make ZX3. Actually, Gunvolt Chronicles doesn't require the player to sing J-pop to beat the final boss. Never mind, I'm calling it now, it's way worse than Gunvolt 2.